Hello, I'm Joachim Olomir, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at how to create a basic shader in ShaderForge. You can open ShaderForge by clicking Window and then ShaderForge. And we're going to create a new shader. I'm just going to keep the default name for now. What you see now is the main window of ShaderForge. On the left hand side you have the mesh preview of your shader, as well as a bunch of settings that we're going to take a closer look at later. On the right hand side you have the node browser of all the currently available nodes in ShaderForge. In the middle you have the ShaderForge node area that you place all of your nodes that you want to use in your shader. And in this case we're going to create a very basic shader with a diffuse texture that is tinted by a color as well as a normal map. So if you go to the node browser you should see a texture 2D node. Click and drag that one into the node view and then give it a name such as diffuse, and then click the select button to give it a texture. And in this case I'm going to pick a concrete texture. You can then connect the RGB output of the diffuse node into the diffuse input of the main node. The shader should then recompile and you should have a visible mesh preview on the left. So now we're going to add a normal map, and you do that basically the same way. There are multiple ways of adding nodes. Now we just drag the node from the node browser into the node view, but you can also right click to access a context menu. Just go to Properties and then Texture 2D. We should give this node a name as well. And I'm naming it Normal, just to make sure that people know what it is. And then click the Select button and pick a normal map texture. And then connect the RGB output of the texture node into the normal input of the main node. The shader will recompile and we should now have a normal mapped diffuse shader. So what we're going to take a look at now is how to tint this diffuse texture with a color. So in order to do that, we should first give it some space because we're going to add more nodes. So we want to multiply this texture by a color. And there is a property called color as well, so we're going to drag that node out here and then give it a name such as color. So now the question is, how do we combine these two nodes so that the diffuse texture will be tinted by this color? And the most simple way to do that is to use a multiply node, which you can find under the arithmetic category. So you drag the multiply node out there, and then connect the RGB output of diffuse to A, and the RGB output of color to B. You can now see that the result is a little bit darker version of this texture, and that's because the default color is gray. We can change this color to see how different colors affect the texture. So in this case I'm going to pick a yellow color. You can now see that the texture is much more yellow. And we're now going to want to connect this output from the multiply node into the diffuse input of the main node. The shader should now recompile and you should have a yellow tinted shader. So now we've created a very basic shader, but we haven't really put it in game and put it to use yet. So we're now going to create two materials using this shader. So you can close the ShaderForge window, and if you go to your project view, you should have your shader visible there. If you right click and select Create Material, your new material should use the shader you just created. And you could give it a name such as New Shader A, and then duplicate that and name the second one B. You can then create two spheres in the scene view, just so we have something to test it on. And then drag your two new materials onto these two spheres. So what we can do now is to tweak these two materials separately. They both use the same shader that we just created, but they have different materials. So for instance, one of them can use the concrete texture with the concrete normals, and the other one could use a completely different texture and completely different normals as well. And you can of course tile the textures as well in this view. So if you want to tile the normal map, you can simply type 8 into these tiling parameters, and the normal map should tile more. And the color property is separate for both materials as well, so you can change the color of one of them without affecting all of the others. And that's how you basically create a very simple shader in ShaderForge and apply them to two meshes.